MCC, the Reformation of the 20th Century. Welcome to the Priceless Podcast. Hello everyone and welcome to the Priceless Podcast. I'm your host. My name is Michael Sechen. This podcast is made in partnership with the European Forum of LGBT Christian Groups. It is also supported by HMS, and the program or the project that is supported by HMS and these interviews are all together called Let Us Be Heard. Subscribe, like, share, and also comment in the section below, because this can help this podcast to spread more widely, and then other people can hear about this podcast who haven't heard about it yet. You can follow us on Facebook, but there is a new thing, and you can follow us on Instagram too. So I'm going to the 21st century and trying to take use of all the modern technology. Believe me, I'm already tired. My head is so big, but I'm trying my best to do everything I can to get this podcast out there. So now let us go to our guest, and this is a guest that is already known to us because we already published two different things by this guest. So Axel, welcome to the podcast once again. How are you doing today?
Well, I'm very well. I'm excited to be here and talking to you. Thank you for inviting me again, Michael. It's a pleasure to be part of this very exciting thing that people get in conversation with each other. I'm really impressed by your program and by all the different technology channels, and that's nice. So it's so nice to talk to young people who know all those things.
Thank you so much. I don't know if everyone would agree with you that I'm still young, but I'll go with that. I'll take it.
It's an euphemism, so I don't have to say I am so old that I have no idea about all this technique.
For the people who haven't seen the interviews before, can you say a few words about yourself, who you are?
Absolutely. My name is Axel Schwaigert. I am the pastor of Metropolitan Community Church in Stuttgart, Germany. I've been pastor of this church since 22 years now. We were founded in 2000 as part of this larger church of this denomination called Metropolitan Community Churches that is much older. MCC is 50 years old, 52 years old now. I studied in Tübingen, Protestant theology. I came out in the middle of my studies to become a Lutheran pastor, which of course then ended all those dreams, because in those times, in the mid-90s, there was no way to become a pastor in the Lutheran Church in southern Germany as an open gay person. So I found MCC, luckily, and became a pastor in MCC instead. And I then studied in the United States a few times, did a doctorate, which is not that important. And that's how I come here.
The interesting thing is that today we're actually going to try to put all these 52 years of MCC into about an hour, hopefully, that we'll manage to do that. It was so interesting. That's something I wanted to do for some time now. And we talked about it last year that we want to do it this year. And it's interesting because you sent me some materials beforehand, and there are so many interesting things with MCC and what MCC was involved in. So let's just dig into it. So first of all, can you give us a short, or as short as possible, overview of the prehistory and what led towards founding the Metropolitan Community Church?
Yes, of course. I think that's a very interesting and important question to ask, because one way would be to tell the story of MCC would be just starting at the start, like it's in the song by Julie Andrews. Let's start at the very beginning. We need to start a little bit earlier to understand how the world was in the 50s and 60s, just as the background of what happened. Because the world was very, very different in those times. There was no internet. There was no way of communicating as we are used to. And the freedom in our world, especially in the religious world, was much less. I want to start telling you the story by asking the question, why was there suddenly a gay scene? Because there was no gay scene in the 30s or 40s. There was something in Berlin in the 20s, but that was all gone through the war. But during the war, a lot of young men especially were drafted into the military, and suddenly they were cramped together with thousands other young men on ships and other places. And especially in the Navy, they developed a certain freedom. I don't know if you call that freedom, but a certain understanding of themselves as gay men, because they suddenly met other gay men. If you are on a big ship with 2,000 other young men, you find the ones who are interested in you. And when the war was over, they all were sent back to their civilian life. And they were sent back in those places where then the queer history started. It was San Francisco, it was Los Angeles, it was New York. The ports, the harbors where they were just sent off. And of course, if you are a young gay man in his early 20s, just having lived through several years of being together with other young men and doing things in dark corners of your ship, and they did it, then you didn't go back to rural Arkansas, to your little Baptist church, or to the middle of nowhere, somewhere in Minnesota, to the Pentecostal church your parents lived, and who told you you are evil and you will go to hell, and they basically were kicked out of society. So they stayed in the big cities, and that formed the beginning of a gay movement of, yes, there are many of us. We are not this one singular guy who lives like me in a little village in Stuttgart, near Stuttgart, way away from everybody else. But suddenly so the Castro formed, this famous street in San Francisco. The West Hollywood formed in Los Angeles, and the Village in New York. And gay men at that point, and it's gay men, we will talk about lesbians later, it's gay men, they got together in bars and in a gay scene. And the interesting thing was, it was still very, very illegal in the United States to be openly gay in the 50s. There were clear laws against people like you and me. And so it was an underground scene, very much governed by the mafia. They ran those bars and places where you can meet. And I'm telling you this because this is the story that happened to what then later became the Stonewall riots. The Stonewall Inn was in New York, a place where gay men met. But it was it was a place of very ill repute, let's put it that way. And so two things happened in the same time in the 50s and the 60s. That bar scene and the people that met there were very much suppressed. The police did raids after raids. If the police needed a few arrests for their monthly statistics, they would run over one of those gay bars and just pick up. And no, they didn't pick up. They arrested a lot of people. So they made their statistics, and everybody was happy except for those people. Their lives were ruined when they were arrested, because the next day their names were in the newspaper. They would lose their job. They would lose their family. They would lose their reputation. They would lose everything. So it was not an easy time to be gay in this time. On the second level, in the same time, there were already early political movements, because what also happened was, because of people were suddenly together, it was not the individual who just made a wrong decision and went to hell like the pastors told them at home, but they suddenly raised, no, we are a group and we have rights and we are as we are. So early political movements developed. The Mattachine Society was the first gay political movement in the United States that formed in the early 50s. It was a very white, very middle class political movement. So not what happened later in Stonewall. It's not those people, but it was the white people, very often employed by the state, who started a very careful gay movement of protests, of we are the same as everybody else, we pay our taxes as everybody else, we just love differently. So let us just be who we are. So they were the ones dressed in very nicely, and there are pictures of them doing demonstrations. They are all in suits and having nice haircuts and skirts. The women wear skirts and they have nice little messages they carry around. So it's very easy to be a little bit cheeky about them, because as somebody in the 21st century, I can look back at them. At that time, that was a dangerous move. You could lose your job doing that. There was also a women group who started to move and form, the Daughters of Bilitis. They did something very interesting, and again, it shows how dangerous this whole thing was. They had a lesbian magazine, The Ladder. They published, which had book reviews and articles and essays, and it was a magazine, really, most of it text, so no pictures or something like that. Don't get the wrong idea. It was really a very intellectual thing. But they sent it through the mail to their subscribers. The magazine itself was not illegal, but sending it through the mail was, because you used a state agency to promote immorality. So, and they would open the letters, and if they found that you sent that off to somebody else, you violated the postal moral conduct code or whatever, and that got you in trouble. So at that point, a lot of people were very, very suppressed, but it already started a little bit here and there to open up and to understand, yes, we are a group and we have rights to do. And that was the background of what then happened to this little church movement that happened in all of that. So that's when MCC first happened, which is a known story, which I will tell in a moment. But perhaps you have more questions about those early times.
Well, I actually want to go into, how did it come about? How did this idea grow out of everything that was happening? You mentioned Stonewall and all these little efforts of already looking for some rights and supporting each other. And how did it come about to thinking, oh, there is the whole faith thing that also needs some LGBT rights and LGBT people who want to be part of a church?
Yes, I think that's a very important thing you just said. There were always gay people who wanted to live their faith too, not only just to separate from their abusive and hurtful faith experience of the past, but who want to live their faith. And one of those people was a young pastor called Troy Perry. Troy Perry is the founder of MCC, or then became the founder of MCC. He was part of a Pentecostal church movement. Very much early in his life, became a preacher, grew up in this very spirit-led experience of church, and married very early, had children, but also had a gay experience and a gay life. Interestingly enough, also connected to his military experience in some ways. And he basically was thrown out of his church, of the church he was pastoring, because some of his elders or people in his church found out that he was gay. And they one day showed up at his doorstep and basically set him an ultimatum. You are leaving the church now and we will not have you arrested, basically. His marriage broke. He wasn't able to see his children for a long time. He was thrown out of his church, of his faith, of everything he was and believed. And for a while, Troy Perry just started to ignore that and just said, okay, now I'm out and I can live the gay side of my life. But this Christian life, this faith part of himself, that was missing. It's a longer story and step by step, but basically what happened at one point was, and that was in the year before Stonewall, he was part of one of those raids. He was in a bar that was raided, not in New York, but in Los Angeles, because same thing there. If you didn't dress gender conforming, you were breaking the law. So they basically the police stormed this bar, arrested, everybody was there. And Troy Perry ended up in a prison cell for a night with another guy. And this other guy at one point during that night said, it's all horrible. It's all a catastrophe. Nobody loves me. My parents do not love me. My society do not love me. Those people around me, my friends and colleagues, don't love me, and God doesn't love me. And that was the moment when Troy said, wait, that might all be true. That might all be true, that the society doesn't love you and your parents, I don't know your parents, but that God doesn't love you. That's just not true. That is absolutely not true. Later he would say, that's the lie of the devil. And honestly, yes, that's one of those lies that break people's soul. And at that point, Troy decided and said, well, I'm a pastor. I have the education. I have the experience. Why shall I try to be part of a church, of any other church, who throws me out the moment they know who I want to love, who I want to kiss, who I want to have sex with? Why? Why should I try that? I can start my own church. And Troy, being a Pentecostal, went into prayer on his knees, literally, and said to God, look, if you want me to start a church where gay people can worship and can come together, then tell me. I'm willing to do it. Just tell me when. And Troy is one of those people who can hear God. He feels it as a voice, as a lot of Pentecostal people do. I'm more the intellectual thinking guy, but Troy heard it, and for him God said, yes, now, do it now, we need it. And that's when Troy said, okay, I will start a church in the metropolitan area of Los Angeles, hence Metropolitan, for the community, for the gay community, for those people I live with, I work with, I know, and it will be a church, Metropolitan Community Church. And that's what he started. And it's interesting how he started it, because again, there was no internet or no nothing. There was, though, a gay magazine in the United States. The Advocate. It was a national magazine, the first gay magazine. So we are now in the late 60s, 68. And he just took out an advert in this newspaper, a little advert, and said, if you want to have a church for gay people, come to Hannington Road, number so-and-so, on Sunday, the 6th of October, and there will be a church service. And his housemate, his roommate, totally freaked out. Absolutely, totally freaked out. That was the first advert in a gay newspaper that actually gave an address. Because all the other was chiffre, those numbers that they used to communicate. But he just did it as he knew how to start a church. You just say, here we are, come to my house. This is the living room. And that was basically inviting the police to come. And at the third service, the police was there, standing next to the toilet, by the way, because they thought, oh yeah, those gay people will go into the toilet to have sex with, because, yeah, exactly. All those prejudices ran wild at that time. But that's how Troy then started his own first service, as a place where at that point, gay men, because Troy didn't think inclusive at that point. He was a gay man, very much in the Latin community. He didn't think about lesbians that much. The lesbians did tell him very quickly that he forgot them, and he learned, but he confesses nowadays that was not in his first vision. But the first service was already very open. There were straight people and gay people and at least one lesbian and at least one Jewish person. So it was a very diverse group who gathered there in the living room in this little house in Hannington Road.
So you just mentioned that there was the police there next to the toilet watching. How did the authorities react to all of this? And also, how did the community react to the MCC?
Well, the community reacted the community had just waited for this moment to happen. It's really interesting to see this little church grew within weeks to a place where you couldn't hold the services anymore in a living room. So they had to look for rented places. And every time they found a place where they could rent in some women's social hall or something like that, and they found out what they really were, queers, they were kicked out again. So at the beginning, there were a lot of little places where they worshipped for a few weeks and then were thrown out again. But it grew immediately. It grew very, very much. From other cities, he got telephone calls and we are just hearing that you're doing this service for gay people. Well, we can... And can we do this too? And he said, yeah, do it. And I come and preach. And Troy it wasn't about theology at that point. It wasn't about deep theology and deep biblical. It was about salvation. Yes, you are loved by God. It was about community. Yes, we can be a community. It was about Christian social action. But it was mainly, I think his main sentence at that point was, God doesn't have stepsons and stepdaughters. God doesn't have stepchildren. But all of us are loved children. And for queer people at that time, who again and again were thrown out of their churches, that was a revelation. That was more than a reformation of church. That was a revolution. That was just mind-blowing. People suddenly could come together and express their faith again. You see, I'm really excited about this because it must have been breathtaking at that moment. So it very much grew. In 68, it was the first service. In 72, we already had 35 groups and churches meeting all over the United States. So that really very much happened. The authorities at that point didn't really care. It was just a bunch of queer people, and they were doing what all queer people in their eyes were doing, having wild sex in the toilet and all those kinds of stuff. So there was the usual harassment and in that time, usual harassment. Interesting, the other churches reacted very, very badly, as it was to expected. So the reaction from the other churches were really wild. They didn't respect us. It was just really, really bad. And so it was difficult to start this church, but it was also very exciting at that time.
From what you're saying, that the churches were reacting really badly, what happened? How did the churches react? What did they do?
Well, it started from preaching against this new group. It sparked a whole wave of anti-gay and anti-homosexual rhetoric. As I said, there were no way that we could start worshiping in somebody else's church, rent a church hall or something like that. And thanks to a guy who, at this very early stage, let the MCC use his cinema for rent-free. He said, "I'm not charging you rent, but you will save that money to buy a building," which they did. MCC was the first queer organization, as far as we know, in the world. It might be somewhere in some culture I know nothing about. It might be something else, but as far as we know, we were the first group that actually owned his first building, because in the early MCC bought in 1970 a very rundown church building, renovated that, and therefore owned the first building of a queer group and a queer church. In 1973, only 3 years later, the church was burned down. And it was very clearly arsonage. It was very clearly an attack to this church. In the first few years, several of our buildings burned down, and there were life threats, and they all came from the religious right, very clearly from other religious people and organization. So difficult times.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's one of the sad parts to hear. You already mentioned that some lesbians early started to raise their voices that, hey, we are here too. So can you talk a little bit more about women in MCC and how this whole process went with including women? Were they included?
As I said, in the early idea of MCC, and really, we have to own that we are not the paradise. We are not the better church. We are just part of our society where we live in, and the gay community at that time was very male orientated, and Troy's idea was very male orientated. The first people who became pastors then in MCC were men, but of course very early women showed up in churches too, because they have the same experience. They were thrown out of their churches when it became clear that they're living with another woman. They wanted to live their faith, and they were always part of this gay revolution. We must not forget, it was lesbians who supported Stonewall. It was the trans community that supported Stonewall. It wasn't the white Mattachine society, middle class white people who did Stonewall. I know the Stonewall movie paints it that way, but it's historically wrong. It was the Latinx, the little twins, the people living on the street, selling their bodies. Those were the people. It was the trans community and the lesbians. And especially in our church, a few very strong women leaders showed up. I just looked it up. We had then national meetings, and in one of our first national meetings, only 10% were women. So it was really very, very male and very white. And in the beginning, they even discussed if they would ordain women. It's just amazing. They just came out of this experience of being thrown out of a church because they were gay. And then they started to, we are not so quite sure if women can be, because they just brought their own history with them. So those women had to fight for it. And when you look at the first early documents, it was all about male. It was, God came to save mankind. That kind of language. It's really interesting, and there were women who had studied theology through other churches, but at that point we are told, you can be Sunday school teacher or marry a pastor and support him, and they showed up at MCC and said, we want to be pastors in our own rights. So there was a huge discussion. And one woman, one of my religious heroes, Frida Smith, challenged them, really literally challenged them and said, I want that in the bylaws of this church, everything that is male is everywhere where it says he or man, it will be substituted for he and she and men and women. And instead of actually having a vote and doing this, they had Frida, they had to go through the whole bylaws. So Frida Smith, for hours and hours and hours in this conference, stood up, raised both of her hands, which is in America a sign for an order of business, and said, I want paragraph 1, sentence 1, where it says he or the male pastor to be changed into he and she. So they had a vote. She sat down, she stood up, raised her arms and said, in paragraph 2, sentence 1, there is he. I want to have this replaced by he and she. So they voted. They went through the whole thing. But that was the beginning of our way of inclusive language, because we also realized God is not he. We not only can't we talk about our pastors and our members and our people as only he, and we mean the women too, but we need to say men and women. So that was a process which then led to this whole discussion about, there is female images of God we can talk about. The spirit is female, so that develops. But that was a huge fight in the 70s. Frida Smith and Nancy Wilson, those early leaders who were carrying their churches, had to fight that, and they won against us men. And I'm so grateful for them. Really, Frida is my religious hero.
We did talk a little bit, and I think it's so important to know what the 80s and 90s brought to you and what it meant for gay people living in, gay, lesbian, LGBT people these times.
Well, what happened was there was not only the gay movement, but also the sexual revolution. So our societies through the 70s and into the 80s became much more open, at least in what's called the West, Western Europe and the United States. So we moved into a period of freedom. it was this period of, hey, we are there, we are queer, get used to it. And just at that moment in the early 80s, when we then started as a church talking about theology again, because before that it was just about living and being and suddenly being allowed to, there was this thing that happened that young people suddenly, young men suddenly became ill. They developed atypical pneumonias. They developed very rare cancers that at that point, before that, a sarcoma or a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma were very rare cancer. And suddenly medical facilities saw a lot of young gay men contracting those diseases. And that was when they later found out it's a virus, it's HIV, it's and for a while it was just like, it was the big shock of the gay community, and then the dying started, and the late 80s and the early 90s were really the time when if you had a diagnosis of HIV and AIDS, it was a death sentence. It was a matter of less than a year of life expectancy from the diagnosis to the full-blown AIDS. So for the community reacted, the bathhouses closed, the liberties we had fought for were gone, but it was also the time of losing a lot of young men. MCC lost about 2/3 to 3/4 of their male clergy. My very dear colleague Jim Mitulski tells us he was the pastor of MCC in San Francisco at that point, which was one of the ground zeros. He said, if you didn't go to church for 4 weeks and you came then back, you didn't ask who died, you asked who is still living, because that was the shorter list. He said he had 5, 6, 7 funerals a week. Every day somebody died. It was just unbelievable, and nobody could do anything. It was the time where we just tried to survive. And again, the churches failed their people. Most people didn't want to touch HIV and AIDS patients. They were the lepers of the time. It was interestingly a Buddhist temple who started the first gay hospice in San Francisco. It wasn't a church. It was a Buddhist temple who did that. So for us nowadays, it's really very difficult to understand, but it was visible. It was a visible illness. I remember people having sarcosis, sarcoma in their face in the 90s, really withering away. It was. I just want to tell those people who listen to us, if you know people who survived that time, who were out in that time, they are now in their 70s, 80s, go and talk to them. Let them tell the story, because that's gay story too. Gay story is not just gay pride and being free and going to disco. It's that too. Just go and talk to those people, because they are the witnesses. And at that point, they had the first medicine that helped was ACT. You had to take that every 3 hours during the day. So they had pill boxes with little alarms built in them. And I remember that you sat in a cafe and suddenly it goes beep 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 beep, and he just took out his pill box and just took his pill, and that was normal. That was absolutely normal. Only in 2000 when the combination therapies started, that changed. But in that time, the women saved us as a church and as a community, because the women, they got their act together. They cared for the for the sick and cared for the dying. They made sure that the churches were still going, and a lot of the gay community was still going, and they really took on that challenge. If we nowadays have this, oh yeah, those are just a few lesbians, brothers, we have to thank them very, very much for what they did in those times, I tell you.
Thank you for sharing this. I mean, I had goosebumps all over my body the whole time, and I can only imagine what it meant living in these times and just losing one friend at a time. I think that sometimes it's so hard to even grasp what it means. I think we just are within a pandemic that we kind of hope as humanity that it's going towards an end. And this was actually a pandemic, which was for those people who were very much involved and close to all those men. It was much more horrible than COVID because you were just losing everyone left and right.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's,
and
by
most
the
of the
way,
time,
Michael, that would be an own podcast. I can tell stories about that. Perhaps we can talk about that later. But it was very difficult times, which we should not forget as a gay community because it's part of our history.
I'm kind of torn because right now we just talked about this really difficult times. At the same time, we passed the time when the Pride March started, and we didn't mention a very important role that MCC played in the Pride March. Can you talk about it? I don't want to disrespect all the victims of the AIDS times, but I think that this is also very important.
I don't think we disrespect the victims of the AIDS times because those were the young people who actually did that. It's all part of our history, and we also can talk about the good times because there were good times, especially what you just mentioned around Stonewall. So Stonewall happened in 1969. There was that big riot in New York, where for the first time gay people fought back against the system and the police and the forces that wanted to suppress us. A year later, they started to talk about how can we remember what happened last year, so the idea started to actually celebrate Stonewall with a memory, and they thought about, let's have a demonstration, let's have a little parade, huh? And there was a little group marching on the pavement in New York. They did that just in Los Angeles. There was a little group of people around Troy Perry and a few other leaders of MCC who said, we want to do that. So they tried to register in West Hollywood, which was one of those gay neighborhoods. We want to register a parade. And as it was to be expected, the police said no. Because they wouldn't let queers march through their city. The sheriff said, "I'm not letting queers march through my city," and they just said no. Actually, they said no in a way that they said, "Okay, you need to do a down payment of $1 million for damages, because if all those queer people rampage through West Hollywood, there will be a lot of damage," and just ask for a lot of other things that for a normal demonstration at that time, if you were a workers' union or whatever wanting to do a march, they wouldn't ask for that. And that's the other side of Troy Perry. Troy Perry is not somebody who is afraid of anybody, because one of his books is called Don't Be Afraid Anymore. And he said, I wasn't afraid of anymore. And he just went and sued the city of West Hollywood so that they had to allow the gay parade. And got a lawyer from the congregation to actually file that complaint against the police of West Hollywood, and they came before a judge, and the judge, to everybody's surprise, including the gay group, because they never thought they would be allowed to do that, the judge said, hey, yeah, they are paying tax, they have the right to do it, they have to allow to have the march in 4 days. that was the hook, because the judge thought, okay, well, I'm allowing that, but they will not be able to arrange that by next Monday or whatever it was. I don't know exactly what day it was. So I guess the judge thought, okay, by that way I'm granting them their rights, but they will not be able to do it. And within a few days, they basically with telephones called everybody they knew and said, come, dress your poodle in pink. That was one of the words. Come with your car, come dress up. We are going to march. And that was the first Gay Pride March, the first Stonewall Remembrance March, which we now celebrate all around the world. And as Gay Pride, or Christopher Street Day, as we are calling it in Germany, because the Stonewall Inn was on Christopher Street. The Gay Pride marches, they started in Los Angeles, sued by a pastor of a queer church, and the city had to allow that. So those were the moments when suddenly queer people celebrated their lives and lived their lives and were able to march and stand up for themselves and don't be afraid anymore.
Amazing. I want to also, now that we're talking about Gay Pride, the Pride March and the demonstrations, I want to talk, there is another day that is where MCC is very much involved and that actually everyone knows about, and it's so famous that mostly on that day there are many concerts and all sorts of happenings, but I'll let you tell a little bit more about that.
Yeah, too. Well, that we are very what you're talking about is World AIDS Day. There we are right back into remembering remembering our victims. It became very clear that we had to deal with that experience of our queer life, and the pastor of MCC in San Diego had the idea. And at that point, together with other churches, because other churches realized we have to do something around this too, started a night-long vigil. A vigil is when you stay in the church for the whole night with candles and you pray and you meditate and you bring your grief in front of God. And that basically was the first World AIDS Day. The World Health Organization, there were people organizing that too. They combined their efforts with the church effort at that point. So the World AIDS Day has two parents, but one is MCC, because that was always one of the important things of MCC. It was not just, we never understood ourselves as a church where we are so far removed from the world, and we huddle together and we are singing nice little songs and listening to nice little sermons, but we don't want to have anything to do with the world. That was never what MCC wanted to be. It was always, we are there for the world. We are not fleeing from the world, which a lot of churches do. They retreat from the world. We want to be part of the world and in the world. And from that understanding of Christian social action, we have to change the world We want to try to make the world a better place. That's when World AIDS Day started, as a way to remember who we lost and to fight for their lives, and nowadays fight against stigma. So it has developed into something much broader, but in the beginning it was really grieving, and MCC tried to do that as a church, as the memory of the community, to hold all those together.
At one point, you mentioned it was all men, and you emphasized white men. So, can you talk a little bit about the issue of racism and how did MCC tackle this whole question of race and racial inclusion?
Yeah. Again, as much as I love my church and as much as I think this church is the best thing since the Reformation, and in German we say the best thing since the invention of chocolate, it is a great church. It is a very diverse, multifaceted church. Because we come from so many different backgrounds. In our church history, people came from all different, they were Baptists and Catholics and Orthodox and and Lutherans, and they all came together. We are a church that is not founded because of a theological issue. Usually new churches build themselves because of a theological issue. Luther had an issue with the way the Roman Catholic Church handled certain things. The Baptists had an issue with baptism, and so on. We were founded around the gay experience. So a lot of people just came together with all this different... So we sang songs from every spectrum of the church. We sang the Roman Catholic hymns and the Baptist hymns and everything. We have very liturgical services, and we have the whole Pentecostal movement. And that all came together. What we totally forgot for a long time, I believe, that our society, and especially the American society, we really have to talk about the American experience, the US American experience, that society is not just as one-leveled and one-faceted, and everybody looks like the two of us look, but it's much more diverse. Unfortunately, the African American experience in the whole gay movement was again a totally different than the white male experience. Even in our gay scene, to this day, I have to say, it's very difficult to be an African American man. African American men are not totally included in our society, in our places, in our bars and in our groups. They are very often sexualized, but not included. The same with Asian, with people of Asian descent. They are very often in some way fetishized, but not included. And that's the description of the American society nowadays. We know about racism issues in the United States. And the same happened, unfortunately, in our church too. And for a long time, I think we didn't see it. Because we were so proud of being the queer church, and we are better than the non-queer church, and we are this female church, and we are much better than the Roman Catholic Church. And what happened was our second moderator, Nancy Wilson, retired after serving quite a long time. And we had several possible candidates. And one of these candidates was a very capable, very wonderful, strong African-American woman, Darlene Garner. Again, one of my personal heroes. I have to say that she really changed our church and fought a lot of good fights. And for many reasons, and I don't want to go into that conflict, we didn't elect any of those candidates. It was an age issue included in this whole thing and a generational shift. But suddenly, the African American community in our church said, well, this is racism. We just didn't want this woman because of her color. And it's very difficult for me as a white gay man of many privileges to talk about this, because the other side of racism is privilege. And as a white man, we live in privilege. I can travel everywhere in the United States, and I speak English, I have a credit card, I'm white, I'm male, I have all the privileges. The reality is that a lot of our people don't have those privileges. They are female, and as such discriminated against. They are African American or Asian American or Native American or any other Hispanic American, any other of those groups. They are discriminated against in education and everything. And suddenly we had to face that. That was a very painful experience for us, especially, I guess, in a special way for us white men, because we had to face our systems that we didn't even see. It was painful for the African American people in our church. We are in this process of reconciling and of talking and of trying to understand what the American society doesn't understand yet. So that's one of the fights we have right now. The other fight is international. We are, as a church, we are an international church. But we are still an English-speaking church, because most of our groups are in America and in England and in Canada and in Australia. But there are churches in middle, what we call middle and southern America. So everything south from Mexico. That's very growing. We have churches that speak Spanish and Portuguese. And how do we include that? So this is what our challenges is, because, and I think that's not just now, oh yeah, but these are the problems and stupid U.S. American society and Trump who made it worse. No, this is a theological issue, because if we want to be fully diverse church as God created the world diverse, we have to live with this diversity, and learn to talk, listen to our different languages, listen to our different cultural experience, because it's, as you know, translation is never about language alone. It's also about translating a culture and cultural background, an experience of growing up. What food do you eat? What shows on TV do you watch? What books do you read? All that. And if we want to work in a world towards a more inclusive and diverse experience, we need to face those issues. And that means we have to face our racism, our international looking down at other cultures and countries. And that's we have to face that, and that's the big challenge of MCC and of our cultures today. And for the queer community, also the trans experience, because we also have to face our experience that it's not just about gay men and lesbian women. It's about bisexual, it's about the trans people in their whole range of trans experiences, transsexuality, trans identity, trans experience. We need to face diversity as a challenge and as an opportunity. I think it's very important that we as a community and as a church realize that male and female are social constructs and are not something that everybody experiences in the same way. That's sometimes very difficult because it starts with language. But I believe if we want to live as a community, as a church and a gay community in solidarity, we have to look into that and educate ourselves and do that. And I'm glad that we are moving into a situation where we are more queer.
So I'm looking at the time, and we of course overstepped the 1 hour, but as said, it's hard to put 52 years into 1 hour. But I want to ask you at the end, there are more and more churches going towards LGBT inclusion, affirming, even blessing and marrying same-sex couples and accepting trans people. Where is MCC headed towards?
Well, first of all, there's a difference between tolerance and acceptance. I totally agree. A lot of churches move towards tolerating, but tolerating only means okay, good. If they are there now, I'm just letting them. And there is in my background church this whole discussion of, okay, we are not going to marry them, but we are doing a blessing in the privacy of their homes. It looks like things are moving, but not everywhere it's totally moved the way we want. So we still have a long way to go. And I have to mention Rome and the Orthodoxy again. But also, I believe moving on from this experience, when we started my church here in Stuttgart, we decided to call ourselves, we want to be a church for all. And that meant for us that we couldn't rent a room that wasn't wheelchair accessible. And we didn't have anybody in a wheelchair at that time. But we said, if we want to welcome all, we need to be accessible. And sure enough, a friend of my brother's called me one day and said, Axel, can I and my girlfriend come to church? And I went like, yes, because we are a church. We also welcome straight people. And and he said, no, can I come with my girlfriend? And then I realized the girlfriend is in a wheelchair. And it was a matter of, are there steps? And to this day, there are steps in front of many altars, which tells a person in a wheelchair, you can't reach the altar because there is a step. So there is a lot to do. There's a lot to do for trans community. There's a lot to do for other people. Right now in the crisis now with Ukraine, what we are right now trying to do with help of activists in Romania, to help people to get out of Ukraine and get them settled somewhere else who are queer, because they are vulnerable in a vulnerable group, in a vulnerable situation. And honestly, there are so many churches with so many old ladies that have a lot of money and are willingly giving those money to set up a kindergarten for those poor Ukrainian kinders. Nothing against the kindergarten for Ukrainian children, but who is thinking about this trans activist who needs to get out because he will be the first to be killed, or she will be the first to be killed by and that's what we are doing. We still try to be there for people, and I'm 54 now. I don't think that I'm going to run out of work, and as long as I live, MCC will not run out of work. It's not the same work as 50 years ago, where it was all about white gay men trying to be able to celebrate service. We are gone by that, but it's other things, and there is still a lot of work. MCC has not run out of his work. We just have to find it again. The trans questions, ordaining trans people. How do we celebrate church in a computer age? We celebrate communion, giving bread and wine through the internet nowadays. Most other churches would say never again. Nobody can do that, but we are going to do this. We just want to try it and live it. There is no end yet.
Thank you, Axel, so much. I'm kind of sad that we are stopping so suddenly, but at the same time, we have to at this point. Thank you, dear viewers and listeners, for being with us. I hope this was at least a little bit interesting as much as it was for me, because I really enjoyed it. As said in the beginning, this podcast is made in partnership with the European Forum of LGBT Christian Groups. It is part of the Let Us Be Heard series supported by HMS. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, tell others about this podcast, and also if you want, you can comment, leave any questions. If I see that you have a question for Axel, I will see if he can maybe answer it. So links, oh yes, I will add some links in the podcast description below. There are also some books where you can find out a little bit more or much more about the whole MCC history. I will put a link to the MCC webpage. If you want to visit a church, there is definitely a list of churches that you can visit. So thank you for being with us. Bye. See you soon, and bye, Axel. Thank you.
Thank you.